It started with footprints on my lawn. Just small ones at first, a sign someone had cut across my property again. But when the HOA president herself, Karen, began doing it daily, clipboard in hand and smug grin on her face, I realized this wasn't just about grass. It was about control. Every warning I gave her, every polite request, only made her bolder, like she owned the ground beneath my feet. And when she stepped onto my property one last time, she had no idea what I'd built waiting for her. What would you do if your HOA refused to respect your home? Daniel Harper had always been the kind of neighbor everyone liked. In his late 30s, clean-shaven, with an easy smile and a calm, thoughtful presence, he'd moved to Lakeview Estates to escape the chaos of city life. The neighborhood was quiet, rows of beige two-story homes with perfect lawns, glimmering driveways, and a peaceful lake that caught the afternoon sun. It was the kind of place that promised order, safety, and civility. Or so he thought. Daniel wasn't flashy. He worked from home as a freelance architect, spent his mornings jogging around the lake, and his evenings tinkering in the garage with small woodworking projects. He took pride in maintaining his lawn, not obsessively, but enough to blend in with the community's tidy aesthetic. Lakeview Estates wasn't cheap, but Daniel saw it as an investment in peace of mind. Then there was the HOA, the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association, run by Linda Myers, a woman who seemed to treat the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Early 50s, blonde bob, always dressed in pastel blazers with pearl earrings. Linda had a voice that could cut glass and a smile that never reached her eyes. She carried her clipboard like a badge of authority, enforcing community excellence one violation notice at a time. At first, Daniel didn't think much of her. She was polite enough during his first meeting, welcoming him with a firm handshake and a brochure full of community guidelines. But even then, he noticed something in her tone. The way she said, "We take pride in keeping Lakeview consistent," as if individuality was something to be corrected. For a while, things were fine. Daniel followed the rules, paid his dues, and minded his own business. His next-door neighbor, George Thompson, a retired engineer in his 60s, often waved from his porch, offering gardening tips or just casual conversation. There was a quiet understanding between them. Keep the peace, respect the space, and life stays simple. But that peace began to shift the morning Daniel found his garbage bins moved from the side of his house to the curb. With a note attached in bold letters, "Improper storage, HOA Notice Number 144. It was signed by Linda herself. Daniel frowned, checking the rulebook. The bins were exactly where the HOA diagram said they should be. Maybe it was a mistake. He placed them back, sent a polite email to the HOA office, and thought that would be the end of it. The next week, another note appeared. This time, it wasn't the bins. It was the height of his grass. Out of regulation. Please maintain uniform appearance. The grass was freshly mowed, neat, and healthy. George even confirmed it looked fine. Still, the warning came. Daniel brushed it off again. After all, maybe Linda was just thorough. But then came the footprints, faint but distinct, cutting diagonally across his yard, straight from the sidewalk to the HOA's administrative office across the street. At first, he thought it was a delivery driver or maybe a neighbor's kid. But one morning, while sipping coffee by the window, he saw her, Linda Myers, clipboard in hand, walking straight through his lawn like it was her personal shortcut. Daniel froze. She didn't even glance his way, just crossed, jotting something on her notepad before disappearing behind the HOA building's glass doors. He almost laughed at the absurdity. Maybe she didn't realize. Maybe it was just once. But it wasn't once. It became routine. Every weekday, around 8:30 a.m., Linda would cut through Daniel's property like clockwork, heels sinking slightly into the damp grass. The same confident stride, the same air of superiority. Sometimes she even stopped to inspect his hedges or peek toward his porch before continuing on. Daniel tried subtle deterrents at first, sprinklers timed to go off. Small please stay off the grass signs, even polite greetings that made his presence known. None of it worked. She either ignored him completely or smirked as if to say, "What are you going to do about it?" Then came the HOA fines. First, $50 for unsanctioned signage. Then, $200 for unauthorized lawn modifications when he adjusted his sprinklers. It was infuriating. The same person who trespassed onto his yard was now penalizing him for trying to protect it. That was when Rachel Lynn, his friend and occasional legal advisor, entered the picture. A sharp, level-headed attorney in her late 30s, Rachel couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You have security cameras, right?" she asked. Daniel nodded, though at the time he hadn't needed them for much. "Good," she said. "Start saving the footage." He installed an additional camera facing the front lawn. Within 2 days, he had his proof clear as daylight. Linda, clipboard in hand, walking through his property like she was conducting an inspection. No permission, no acknowledgement, just entitlement in motion. Daniel brought it to the next HOA meeting, a small room filled with folding chairs, laminated charts, and bored-looking residents. He waited until the community concerns portion and calmly presented the video. The room murmured, some neighbors leaning forward in disbelief. Linda's face turned to stone. "Mr. Harper," she said, forcing a tight smile, "the HOA has access privileges for property evaluation purposes through private lawns." Daniel interrupted, keeping his voice steady. Without notice, without consent. A hush fell over the room. Even George, sitting in the back, gave him a small nod of approval. But Linda didn't back down. "We act in the interest of the community," she said sharply. "If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be so defensive." That was the moment Daniel realized this wasn't going to stop. Not with polite emails. Not with video evidence. Linda wasn't just enforcing rules. She was asserting dominance. And if he didn't push back, she'd walk all over him, literally. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel stepped outside into the cool evening air. Staring across the manicured lawns of Lakeview Estates, porch lights flickered on one by one, reflections dancing on the lake. From her office window, he could see Linda watching him, clipboard tucked under her arm, lips curling into the faintest, knowing smile. That's when he decided if the HOA wanted to play games, he'd build something they wouldn't forget. The morning after the HOA meeting, Daniel Harper woke to the sound of sprinklers and the faint hum of lawnmowers echoing through Lakeview Estates. It was peaceful, almost deceptively so, like the calm before a storm that hadn't fully formed yet. He thought maybe, just maybe, the confrontation had been enough to make Linda back off. But when he stepped outside, that hope shattered. A fresh notice was taped to his mailbox. Unauthorized camera installation, Violation Act 155. He read it twice, his jaw tightening. The very camera he'd installed to catch her trespassing was now the reason for another fine. $150 this time. The letter, signed in Linda's familiar, looping handwriting, cited aesthetic disruption to the neighborhood's architectural harmony. Architectural harmony. The words felt like a slap. Daniel laughed bitterly and crumpled the notice in his hand. He knew then this wasn't about rules. This was personal. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated. Every few days, another citation appeared. Improper mailbox color, unapproved porch decor, non-standard grass patterning. Each one more ridiculous than the last. And each one came with a fine. He checked the HOA rulebook obsessively, cross-referencing every claim. His mailbox was regulation color, the same factory shade as every other one on the street. His porch decor, a single wooden chair and a hanging plant. Nothing unapproved. As for grass patterning, He had no idea what that even meant. Still, the notices kept coming. Linda had found her weapon, paperwork. She knew how to bury someone under it. Daniel's neighbors started noticing too. Some sympathized quietly, others avoided him altogether. The HOA board was tight-knit, and no one wanted to be Linda's next target. Only George, his retired engineer neighbor, stayed in touch. He'd often lean over the fence in the evening, shaking his head. "That woman's been running this place like a fiefdom for years," he said. "You're the first one who stood up to her." Daniel sighed. "It's not even about the fines anymore. It's the principle." George nodded slowly. "Then hit her where it hurts, her reputation." That idea lingered. He began collecting everything: photos of the trespassing, timestamps, emails, even audio from the HOA meetings. Rachel, his attorney friend, helped him draft formal complaints to the HOA board and the local housing authority. "You're building a paper trail," she said. "If this goes to court, documentation wins." But documentation didn't stop Linda's tactics. It only made her bolder. One morning, Daniel woke to find bright orange stakes driven into the edge of his lawn, HOA markers designating maintenance territory. A notice followed, due to ongoing noncompliance. "The HOA will assume temporary control of your front yard to ensure visual consistency." His stomach dropped. She was claiming control over his own property. He called the HOA office immediately, but the receptionist, a soft-voiced woman who clearly wanted no part in the feud, only said, "Mr. Harper, all actions have been approved by the board." By the board. Everyone knew that meant Linda. Daniel stormed outside, yanking up one of the stakes in frustration. Across the street, he spotted her, clipboard in hand, watching. That smug, confident smile again. The look of someone who knew she couldn't be touched. He wanted to shout, to tell her to stay off his property once and for all, but he stopped himself. Not yet. Losing his temper would only feed her narrative, aggressive homeowner. No, he needed something smarter. That night, Daniel stood in his garage, staring at his tools. An idea began forming, something bold, something that would make sure Linda never stepped foot on his lawn again. But first, he needed proof of her hypocrisy. So he waited, and she came. Every morning, just like before. He adjusted his cameras, repositioned them for better angles, and gathered everything. Footage of Linda cutting across the yard. Footage of her inspecting his porch. Even one clip where she stopped, scribbled a note, and smiled to herself before leaving. Each clip fueled him more. But when he presented this new evidence to the HOA board, they dismissed it. "We've reviewed the situation," they said in a cold, rehearsed tone, and found no misconduct. HOA officers have discretionary access for community enforcement. Discretionary access, another shield. Daniel sat through the rest of the meeting in silence, heart pounding. Every neighbor in the room could see the tension, the unfairness. But no one spoke. Not a single word in his defense. When the meeting ended, Linda brushed past him, leaning close enough to whisper, "You're only making things harder for yourself, Daniel. Why don't you just cooperate?" Her perfume lingered as she walked away, sickly, sweet, suffocating. It was the smell of arrogance. That night, Daniel opened his laptop and started planning. If the HOA wanted to control his property, they could deal with what he built on it. Something visible. Something undeniable. Something that would make every neighbor question Linda's authority. He drew up plans for a structure, small, tasteful, and fully compliant with the HOA's own design codes. He double-checked every dimension, every regulation. Then, over the weekend, he got to work. By Monday morning, the unauthorized construction notice was already on his door. Linda stood at the curb, clipboard raised, voice sharp. "Mr. Harper, you can't build without pre-approval." Daniel smiled calmly. Actually, Section 4B of your handbook says decorative installations under 4 feet don't require review. Her jaw tightened. She hadn't expected him to know the rules better than she did. Over the next few days, Daniel kept building. Neighbors began slowing down as they drove by, curious. From a distance, it looked like a wooden fence extension, nothing out of place. But up close, it was something else entirely. A motion-activated sprinkler system disguised as landscaping art, precisely positioned along the edge of his yard. When someone stepped across the property line, sensors triggered a controlled burst of water, harmless, but enough to make a point. The first time it went off, Linda was the target. It was early morning. Clipboard in hand, she strutted across his lawn as usual, until the sprinklers roared to life, soaking her from head to toe. She froze, shrieking, mascara streaking down her face as she stumbled backward. Daniel, watching from his porch, kept his expression neutral, coffee cup in hand. She glared at him, dripping, humiliated. "This is harassment," she shouted. Daniel simply pointed to the small sign on his fence. Automated irrigation in progress. Private property. Perfectly legal. Perfectly fair. By noon, photos of the drenched HOA president were circulating in the neighborhood group chat. Some residents laughed quietly. Others pretended not to see. But the balance had shifted. Linda's authority, once absolute, was cracking. Still, she wasn't done. That evening, Daniel received a certified letter. Cease and desist, unauthorized water discharge system. Accompanying it was a $500 fine for creating unsafe conditions. He stared at the letter. Then at the footage of Linda trespassing again right before triggering the sprinklers. The hypocrisy burned. He sent the footage to Rachel. She watched silently, then said, "Daniel, you've got enough to file for harassment. Maybe even a restraining order." He hesitated. "Wouldn't that make things worse?" Rachel smiled faintly. Sometimes worse is what it takes to make it stop. The next HOA meeting was the most crowded yet. Word had spread fast. Everyone wanted to see what Daniel would do. He walked in calmly, carrying a folder under his arm. Linda sat at the front, visibly tense, pretending not to notice him. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel stood. "I'd like to submit new evidence," he said. "Continued trespassing, targeted harassment, and falsified violations." He placed printed stills from the video onto the table one after another, showing Linda on his lawn. Clipboard in hand, time-stamped and dated. Gasps rippled through the room. A few people even started whispering. Linda's face went pale. "These images are taken out of context. They're all from your security footage, correct?" Daniel interrupted. "Footage you fine me for having." Her mouth opened, then closed again. No response. That moment hung heavy in the air. Even her loyal board members looked uncertain. Daniel continued, voice steady. "I've also filed a formal complaint with the Housing Authority and submitted this documentation to my attorney. Effective immediately, I'm requesting a full review of the HOA's enforcement practices." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Finally, Linda stood abruptly. "Meeting adjourned," she snapped, slamming her clipboard shut. But as she left, something in her eyes had changed, a flicker of fear beneath the fury. Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew this wasn't over. She wouldn't give up power that easily. Not Linda Myers. Not the woman who'd built her entire identity on control. But for the first time since this nightmare began, he had leverage, proof, and a neighborhood beginning to see through her carefully polished facade. The next days were tense. No new notices, no confrontations. Just silence. The kind that feels loaded. Daniel stayed alert, waiting for the next move. Then, late one night, he noticed headlights stop briefly outside his house. A car idled, then drove off. The next morning, His mailbox was gone, torn from the ground, post and all. No note this time, just damage. He stared at the empty space where it once stood, the wind whistling faintly across the lake. The message was clear. If he wanted to keep standing up, the HOA president was willing to play dirty. But Daniel wasn't backing down. Not now. He tightened his jacket, looked toward the HOA office across the street, and muttered under his breath, "You started this. Linda, let's see how it ends." The morning of the court hearing dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that made the whole world feel on edge. For weeks, Daniel Harper had prepared for this day, organizing documents, reviewing recordings, reliving every frustrating moment with the HOA. His lawyer, Rachel Lynn, had warned him, "They'll come at you hard, Daniel. Expect them to play dirty." But nothing could have prepared him for how public it would all become. When he arrived at the Lakeview Community Center, where the HOA held its special disciplinary session, he was greeted by rows of folding chairs and nearly the entire neighborhood in attendance. Cameras flashed. Whispers followed him as he took his seat. At the front, the board sat behind a long table, and, at the center, Linda Myers, her pastel blazer immaculate, her pearl earrings gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It wasn't a legal courtroom, not yet. But this was the stage Linda wanted. Public humiliation disguised as community enforcement. "Mr. Harper," she began, tapping her clipboard as if it were a gavel, "we are here today to address your repeated violations, including unauthorized structures, hostile behavior toward HOA officers," and she paused dramatically, "the deliberate targeting of board members through electronic surveillance." Daniel's jaw clenched. "You mean the footage of you trespassing?" A murmur ran through the room. Linda ignored it, her smile tightening. "This isn't your platform, Mr. Harper. You've repeatedly undermined the values of Lakeview Estates. You've harassed our leadership, defied community standards, and created division where there was once harmony." Rachel leaned in, whispering calmly, "Let her finish." Then we hit back. Linda flipped a page on her clipboard. "Due to the severity of these actions, the board will be voting to impose a $10,000 fine and initiate proceedings to place a lien on your property if non-payment continues." Gasps filled the room. A lien, it was the nuclear option, the HOA's ultimate weapon. Daniel's heart pounded, but his expression remained calm. He stood, facing the audience instead of the board. "You all know me," he began, his voice steady but full of weight. "I've lived here for years." Daniel stepped forward. "You called it enforcement. I call it harassment. And the county agrees. The days of you walking into people's yards, fining them for imaginary infractions, are over." Rachel set down a thick folder on the table, copies of the official complaint, the investigation notice, and every piece of documented evidence. "You're welcome to contact your attorney," she said coolly. "You'll need one." The air in the room felt electric. No one moved, no one spoke. Then a neighbor, one of Linda's former supporters, stood up. "I vote we suspend Linda Myers as HOA president until this is resolved." The motion was seconded instantly. Linda's mouth opened, trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't majority rules," George said from the back, raising his hand. One by one, neighbors lifted their hands. Dozens of them. A clear, overwhelming majority. It was over. The vote passed. Linda slumped back in her chair, her clipboard slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. For a moment, she looked small, fragile even, stripped of her authority, her false composure shattered. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest finally breaking. Rachel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's what accountability looks like," she whispered. But even in victory, there was a strange quiet. The kind that comes after a storm when you're not sure whether to celebrate or brace for what comes next. As the crowd dispersed, neighbors approached Daniel, offering quiet apologies, words of support. "We should have spoken up sooner," one said. "She's been out of control for years." Daniel nodded, grateful but exhausted. "It's done now," he said softly. "At least, I hope it is." But Linda wasn't gone yet. As he gathered his documents, she rose slowly and approached him. Her voice was low, venomous. "You think this is over, Daniel? I built this community. You just tore it apart." He met her gaze evenly. "No, I just reminded it who it belongs to." She glared at him for a long moment, then turned and stormed out, the door slamming behind her with a hollow echo that lingered in the silence. Rachel packed up the remaining files. "She'll fight back, you know," she said quietly. "People like that don't just disappear." "I know," Daniel said, looking out the window toward his street. The lake shimmered faintly beyond the rooftops, calm again after months of chaos. But next time, she won't have the power to hide behind. That night, Lakeview Estates felt different, lighter somehow. Neighbors waved again. The endless notices stopped appearing. For the first time in months, Daniel slept without dread. Still, part of him stayed alert, the part that had learned what unchecked power could do. And he was right too. A week later, a plain white envelope arrived in his mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of the HOA charter with one line circled in red ink. Vacancy appointments must be approved by prior leadership. No signature. Just the faint scent of Linda's perfume. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, his pulse quickening. She wasn't finished. Not yet. He folded the paper carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful, bathed in soft morning light. But behind that calm, something still stirred, a final storm brewing on the horizon. He looked toward the lake, the reflection of his home shimmering in the water, and murmured under his breath, "You lost the board." "Linda, don't lose yourself trying to win it back." The camera would linger there. Daniel standing on his porch, the wind rippling across the lake, tension still hanging in the air, a perfect cliffhanger leading into the resolution. In the weeks that followed the explosive HOA meeting, Lakeview Estates was eerily calm, as if the entire neighborhood was exhaling after years of tension. The lawns still shimmered under morning dew. The lake remained still and reflective, but something in the air had changed. The power that once pressed down on every resident like a weight had lifted. Daniel Harper noticed it first in the simplest ways. No new notices appeared on his door. The HOA newsletter, once filled with rules and reprimands, now featured gardening tips and local events. Even the board meetings became less hostile, quieter, more transparent. Without Linda's domineering presence, people finally spoke freely. But beneath that calm, there was unease. No one had seen Linda since the vote. Her pastel blue Prius had vanished from her driveway. Her windows remained dark, and her house, once perfectly maintained, now had overgrown hedges creeping across the front. It was poetic, Daniel thought. How quickly community order faded without its self-appointed guardian. Then, one morning, a moving truck appeared. Linda was gone for good. George Thompson stood beside Daniel on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching the movers haul out labeled boxes. "Never thought I'd see this day," George said softly. "She's been running this place since it was built." Daniel nodded, but his expression was conflicted. "She deserved to be held accountable," he said, "but I don't think she'll ever understand why. People like her rarely do." George replied, "Control feels like safety to them. Take it away, and they crumble." The words lingered. Daniel wasn't sure if he felt triumph or pity. Maybe both. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived from the County Housing Authority, a formal letter confirming the outcome of their investigation. Lakeview Estates HOA had been found in violation of multiple homeowner protection statutes. The county revoked several of its enforcement powers until a full reorganization was complete, and Linda Myers was permanently barred from holding any HOA position in the state. At the bottom of the letter, in careful legal phrasing, was a single line that made Daniel smile. All prior fines issued to Mr. Harper are rescinded. Damages awarded $48,600. Rachel Lynn called that evening. "Justice served," she said proudly. "You just set a precedent. Other homeowners will be able to cite your case in future disputes." Daniel chuckled quietly. "I didn't plan to be a precedent." "No one does," she said. "But you did something most people are too afraid to do. You stood up to the system." When the check arrived a few days later, Daniel didn't rush to cash it. Instead, he held it for a moment, thinking about what the money really represented. Not just reimbursement, but vindication. Proof that the truth had finally caught up with the lies. That weekend, the neighborhood gathered for a lakeside cookout, the first community event in years that didn't feel forced. Kids played by the water, couples chatted freely, and laughter replaced the usual cautious silence. For the first time, Lakeview Estates actually felt like a community. As the sun dipped low over the lake, painting the water gold, several neighbors approached Daniel to thank him. One older woman said softly, "I almost moved away last year because of her. You reminded me that this neighborhood's still worth something." Daniel smiled, humbled. It's worth it when people care about it, not control it. The following month, elections were held for the new HOA board. Daniel was nominated and won by a landslide. He didn't want the position at first, but George had convinced him. "If good people walk away, the wrong ones step back in," he'd said. "You don't have to be another Linda. Just be the guy who keeps it fair." And that's exactly what Daniel did. Under his leadership, the HOA shifted from punitive to practical. Instead of handing out fines, they offered assistance, shared lawn tools, volunteer repair days, even small community grants for garden improvements. Rules still existed, but they served people now, not power. In time, the phrase Lakeview HOA no longer made people roll their eyes. It became something of a local redemption story, even featured in a regional news article about homeowners reclaiming their neighborhoods from overreach. But Daniel's victory didn't erase the toll it had taken. There were nights he still woke up at the sound of paper rustling, half expecting to find another fine taped to his door. The months of anxiety had carved something into him, a deeper understanding of how fragile peace could be when authority goes unchecked. Rachel once put it best during a late phone call. "HOAs are supposed to protect neighborhoods," she said, "but too often they forget they're made up of neighbors." That line stayed with him. One rainy evening, months after Linda's departure, Daniel decided to walk the perimeter of the lake, the same lake that had framed every chapter of this battle. The reflection of the houses shimmered across the surface, calm, perfect. He stopped at the far side, near the little patch of grass that bordered Linda's old property. The new owners had moved in, a young couple repainting the shutters, cleaning up the overgrown shrubs. It was strange, seeing life return to that house so quickly, as if the chaos had never happened. "Beautiful spot," the husband said, noticing Daniel watching. "Feels peaceful here." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "It didn't used to." When he got home, he walked out to his porch, where the motion-activated sprinklers still lined the edge of his lawn. Silent now, but still there. A small, ironic monument to how it all began. He thought about taking them down, but decided against it. Not out of spite, but as a reminder. Boundaries mattered, both literal and moral ones. The next HOA meeting was different from any before it. There was no raised voice, no intimidation, no smug glances across the table. Instead, residents debated, laughed, even disagreed, but with respect. Daniel sat at the head, not as a ruler, but as a listener. When George spoke up about new park benches, the room voted unanimously. When a young mother suggested starting a community garden, Daniel smiled and said, "Let's make it happen." As he looked around the room, he realized this calm collaboration was what the HOA was supposed to be all along. Outside, the storm clouds cleared, and faint moonlight reflected off the lake through the meeting hall window. The world felt still again. But one night, months later, Daniel received a letter. Not from the HOA, not from the county, but from Linda. It was short, typed, no return address, just a single paragraph. "You think you won, but all you did was expose how fragile people are when they think they have control. Maybe someday you'll understand what it feels like to lose everything you built." He read it twice, folded it neatly, and set it in his drawer without a word. He didn't feel anger, only a strange mix of sadness and closure. She was still fighting a war no one else cared about anymore. He walked outside, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The neighborhood lights glowed softly, reflecting off the calm lake surface. He took a deep breath and smiled faintly. Linda could write all the letters she wanted. The battle was over and the community had healed. Months turned into a year. Lakeview Estates thrived. The once feared HOA became a model for fairness, transparency, and respect. Local papers called it the Lakeview Turnaround. Daniel never saw another fine, another threat, or another trespasser. Instead, he saw neighbors helping one another, fixing fences together, organizing food drives, even holding summer movie nights by the lake. One evening, standing by the water as the sun sank behind the rooftops, Daniel reflected on everything that had happened. The fines, the humiliation, the stress, all of it had led here, to a neighborhood reborn. He realized something powerful. This wasn't just about one man standing up to one HOA. It was about what happens when people stop being afraid to question authority. When they remember that community means all of them, not just the loudest voice with a clipboard. As the screen fades to black, Daniel's voice would close the story in quiet narration. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about reminding people that their home, their peace, is worth protecting, even if you have to fight for it. The final shot would linger on the calm lake at dusk, soft ripples reflecting the lights of Lakeview Estates, a symbol of peace, hard-won, balance restored, and the quiet power of ordinary people refusing to be controlled.